emotion he experienced at her touch. Pleasure was an unknown sensation for Carnage. Bobby hurried through the trees and shrubs in his path, not even looking up. He didn't want to lose her trail. "Hurry the hell up! She can't be that far ahead," he shouted over his shoulder at the men following him. He had to catch this little bitch. Her father had entrusted her care and safety to him while she was there overseeing his investment in 2 businesses located just outside the swamps. Only he'd not exactly held up his end of the bargain. He'd planned on doing his part, but the more he drank and the more he watched her prancing around in those trousers that no woman ought to be wearing, and thought about how much he'd like that little piece of heaven beneath him, the more he decided that he deserved a step up in life. The like remarks coming from his brothers and her holier-than-thou attitude had him deciding that yes, he deserved her. And once he'd had a taste, though it had only been a little taste and not quite all he'd wanted to sample, he'd been loath to let her go. So he'd kept her. Hell, it wasn't like he'd tortured her. He'd fed her, he'd allowed her to go outside from time to time. It had only been a couple days, and she'd loved it. Well, he'd loved it. Eventually, she'd come around and be thankful that he'd picked her. Then he'd get to sample all she had to offer. Pretty much everybody in his family'd had to settle. He wasn't settling. He deserved more. All the women in his village vied for his attentions, and this one just needed to be reminded of how lucky she was. Only now the little bitch was on the run. He'd left her outside alone for just a second while he'd went inside to get her a drink, just like she'd asked. No sooner than he'd gone inside did she run for the swamp. And if she managed to get to safety and contact her father, Bobby would have hell to pay. The man was rich as the devil himself, and he'd not stop until he'd made everyone pay for any indiscretion his precious daughter had endured. He had to catch her and force her to see things his way. He'd be a damn good husband. Well, at least till he got bored and moved on, but by then he'd have spent most of her money, so it wouldn't matter what she thought. "Come on, y'all. She went through here." Carnage adjusted the woman in his arms and held her tighter. He'd taken them across several hundred feet through the treetops. He stopped when he was sure the one they were hiding in was thick enough to keep anyone on the ground from seeing them. He squatted on a high limb, close to the trunk of the tree, using his muscular thigh as a perch to place his woman on. She was shaky, and she was shivering. He tried to remove his hand from around her waist to point out the men that were following her path, but she'd clutched at his arm. So instead, he'd removed his hand from her mouth and quickly pointed them out. Again, he tried to communicate as he pointed at the torches obviously headed toward them in the dark. "Shh." She didn't speak, but she nodded her understanding. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward him. He froze, afraid that she'd scream when she saw him. He was not beautiful. He knew he was not beautiful, and he was okay with that. He'd never been beautiful. He was a scary son of a bitch. It worked for him. His kind generally made their way by being scary sons of bitches. Originally, they'd been hired to protect churches, castles, convents, and the like in exchange for food and shelter, but his sovereign had begun to sell their services to anyone who asked. He'd become greedy for coin. Carnage and his brethren had been forced to act as guard and soldier to many who they should have been destroying instead. But they'd been ordered, so they followed those orders. But he'd hit his limit when they'd been instructed to hurt innocents. He was a monster, but he was not so much a monster that he would hurt women and children. He drew the line and refused to participate any further in the goings-on of any who had questionable characters. His sovereign had demanded his loyalty and acquiescence. They'd battled, with Carnage eventually walking away, after he'd destroyed his king. He'd wandered for centuries with more than a few of his brethren following from a safe distance. Carnage was a dangerous male, volatile, unpredictable. But since he'd destroyed their corrupt king, his brothers had no one else to follow, so they followed him. Over time, some had retreated to outer-lying lands of whatever country they'd been in to survive, but in years of late, here in the southern United